I have to get there tonight.
There are moments in a man's life that seem small in the instant they happen, but years later, he realizes they were never small at all. This is the story of one of those moments. A story about a man named Marcus Whitfield, a rainy stretch of road outside a quiet Georgia town, and a woman whose tears would end up costing him more than he ever imagined. Marcus didn't know it yet, but on that night, something was watching him. Something was listening to the choice he was about to make. And whatever he decided in those next 60 seconds would follow him for the rest of his life. This isn't a story about luck, or coincidence, or bad timing. This is a story about what happens when a man is tested, and doesn't even know the test has begun. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus Whitfield was 52 years old, and by every measure that mattered to the people around him, he had made it. 2 decades of long hours had built him a construction company worth more than most men in his town would see in a lifetime. He had a house with a wraparound porch, a truck he'd paid for in cash, and a reputation for being a man who kept his word. But there was another side to Marcus that most people never saw. Somewhere along the way, the man who used to stop and help strangers change a tire, or slip a 20 to someone struggling at the gas station, had disappeared. In his place stood someone harder, someone who had learned, through years of being used and lied to, that kindness was a door people walked through to take from you. Marcus didn't call it bitterness. He called it wisdom. That night, Marcus was driving home from a job site nearly 45 minutes outside of town. Rain had been falling since sundown, the kind of steady, relentless rain that turns a dark road into something closer to a memory than a place. Headlights swallowed up just a few feet ahead of the truck. He was tired in the way a man gets tired after years of carrying everything himself, and all he wanted was his own bed. That was when he saw her. A woman, standing at the edge of the road beside a car with its hazard lights blinking weakly through the downpour. She wasn't waving him down. She wasn't even looking at him. She was simply standing there, in the rain, crying. Marcus slowed the truck without meaning to. Some old part of him, the part he thought he'd buried years ago, told him to pull over. But another voice, louder now, reminded him of the last time he'd stopped for a stranger and what it had cost him. He thought about his business partner who vanished with half his savings. He thought about the man from his own church who'd borrowed money and never looked him in the eye again. So Marcus made a choice. He pressed his foot back down on the gas, and he drove past her, watching her figure grow smaller and smaller in his rearview mirror until the rain swallowed her whole. What Marcus didn't know, in that instant, was that his refusal had already been recorded, not by a camera mounted somewhere along that lonely road, not by any witness hidden in the dark. It had been recorded by something far older, far more patient, and far more concerned with the condition of a man's heart than the condition of his bank account. Marcus drove the rest of the way home in silence, telling himself he'd made the right call, the smart call, the call any reasonable man would make. He had no way of knowing that the woman he left behind in the rain was not who, or what, he believed her to be. And he had no way of knowing that in the weeks ahead, he would give anything, everything, to have that moment back. 3 days passed before Marcus allowed himself to think about the woman in the rain again. He told himself it was nothing, a stranger he'd never see again, a moment already forgotten by anyone who mattered. But something had shifted inside him that he couldn't quite name. His sleep grew thin, his appetite grew thinner, and on the 4th night, sitting alone in his kitchen with the television humming low in the background, Marcus noticed something that stopped him cold. Tucked into an old photo album his late mother had kept, a picture from his college graduation, 26 years old, sat a woman in the background he did not recognize. Same face, same rain-soaked hair, same eyes that seemed to look directly into the camera, directly at him, as though she had been waiting there the whole time for him to finally notice her. Marcus told himself it was a resemblance, nothing more, a trick of an old photograph and a tired mind. But the coincidence gnawed at him in a way facts rarely do. Who was she? Why did her face appear in a photograph taken decades before he'd ever laid eyes on her? And what, if anything, did his decision to drive past her that night actually cost him? These were the questions that began to circle him like static he couldn't turn off. Questions with no clean answers, only more questions underneath them. He began asking around, carefully, quietly, the way a man asks questions when he's afraid of what the answers might mean about himself. To understand what happened to Marcus, you have to understand who he used to be. Long before the construction company, before the wraparound porch, Marcus grew up in a small brick house with a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who left before Marcus turned 6. He learned early that kindness was something you gave away because you had it, not because you expected it back. In his 20s, he was known as the young man who'd give you his last dollar if you needed groceries, who'd drive an hour out of his way for a friend without being asked twice. People loved him for it. His mother used to say that Marcus had a heart too big for the world he was living in, and she worried, even then, that the world would eventually try to shrink it. The shrinking began slowly. First, it was a business partner, a man Marcus had trusted since childhood, who disappeared one weekend with nearly all of their company's savings, leaving Marcus to rebuild from nothing at 34 years old. Then came a friend from his own church, a man Marcus had loaned thousands of dollars to during a hard season, who stopped answering his calls the moment the debt came due. Each betrayal chipped away at something in Marcus that had once come naturally to him. By the time he turned 40, he had built walls so high around his generosity that even he couldn't remember exactly when he'd started building them. He simply woke up one day a different man, successful, respected, and quietly hollow in a way no one around him seemed to notice. His wife Denise noticed. She'd married the version of Marcus who still believed in people, and she spent years watching that version fade into someone more guarded, more calculating, more likely to ask what a person wanted from him before he asked how they were doing. She never stopped loving him, but she grieved, in her own quiet way, for the man he used to be. She often told him that a hard heart doesn't protect you, it just changes what hurts you. Marcus would nod along at dinner and change the subject, the same way he changed the subject any time the conversation got too close to something real. In the weeks following the night on the road, strange things kept happening around Marcus that he couldn't easily explain away. His truck radio, untouched, would sometimes switch on by itself, always landing on the same station, playing an old hymn his mother used to sing while cooking dinner. A homeless man near his office, one Marcus had walked past without a glance 100 times before, looked him directly in the eye one morning and said, almost gently, that some doors only open once. Marcus laughed it off in front of others, but alone in his truck afterward, his hands would not stop shaking. He began to wonder if he was losing his grip on reality, or if reality had simply widened enough to let something else through. Word travels quietly in small towns, and eventually Marcus heard a story from an old coworker about a woman seen crying on that same stretch of road, going back years before Marcus had ever driven it. Some said she appeared to people at the exact moment they were deciding who they wanted to be. A young mother, exhausted and overwhelmed, had once stopped for her and found unexpected strength to keep going. A businessman, cold and dismissive like Marcus, had once driven past her and lost everything within the year: his marriage, his health, his sense of who he was. The stories varied in detail but shared one unsettling thread. The woman never asked for money, never asked for a ride, only for someone to simply stop. Marcus dismissed it at first as small-town superstition, the kind of story that grows taller with every retelling. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled into something larger than coincidence, something with its own memory, its own patience, moving through people's lives long before he'd ever been born. He started driving past that stretch of road slower than usual, scanning the shoulder, half hoping and half dreading that he'd see her there again. Denise noticed the change in him, the long silences, the way he'd stare out the window like he was listening for something only he could hear. When she asked him what was wrong, Marcus, for the first time in years, didn't have a quick answer ready. It was an old pastor, a man named Elder Thomas Greaves, who had served the community for nearly 40 years, who finally gave Marcus something close to an answer. Marcus visited him under the excuse of catching up, but the moment he mentioned the woman on the road, Elder Greaves grew still in a way that told Marcus this wasn't the first time he'd heard the story. The old pastor admitted, quietly, that he had encountered a similar figure decades earlier, in a different town, under different rain. He said he too had driven past her, certain he had good reason, certain the world had taught him better than to trust a stranger's tears. He had carried the weight of that choice for nearly 30 years. Elder Greaves explained what he believed the woman represented. Not a ghost, not a scam, but something closer to a mirror, a test sent to people standing at the exact edge of who they were becoming. He said some people were shown this test as a warning before it was too late to turn back, and others were shown it only after their hearts had already hardened past the point of noticing. He told Marcus that the real question was never who she was, but who Marcus had let himself become by the time she appeared. Marcus sat in that small church office for a long time after the pastor finished speaking. Turning over 20 years of his life like pages in a book he suddenly wished he'd read more carefully. Marcus went home that night and did something he hadn't done in years. He sat outside on the porch in the dark, without his phone, without the television, and simply thought about every person he had quietly stopped helping over the last 2 decades. The employee he'd let go without severance during a hard quarter. The nephew he'd stopped speaking to over a small unpaid debt. The neighbor whose car he used to help start every winter morning. Until one cold season he simply stopped showing up. None of these were criminal acts. None of them would have made the news. But laid side by side, they formed the quiet outline of a man who had traded his open hands for closed fists, one disappointment at a time, until closing himself off had become instinct rather than choice. 2 weeks later, on a night nearly identical to the first, rain falling steady over that same stretch of road, Marcus found himself driving home from another late job site. He told himself it was coincidence. He told himself he wasn't looking for her. But when he saw the familiar shape at the edge of the road, the same car with its hazard lights blinking weakly, the same woman standing silent in the downpour, something inside Marcus finally broke open instead of shutting down. Without deciding to, without calculating the cost, Marcus pulled his truck onto the shoulder, stepped out into the rain, and walked toward her the way he used to walk toward strangers 20 years earlier, before the world taught him not to. When Marcus reached her, the woman lifted her head for the first time, and for one long moment their eyes met. There are moments words cannot properly hold, and this was one of them. Marcus would later struggle to describe what passed between them, only that it felt less like meeting a stranger and more like being truly seen for the first time in years. He asked if she was all right, if she needed help, the exact question he had swallowed weeks earlier. The woman did not answer with words. She simply reached out and touched his hand, and in that instant, every ounce of bitterness Marcus had carried for 2 decades felt, briefly, unbearably light. When Marcus blinked the rain from his eyes, she was gone. Not walking away into the dark, not driving off in the car that had supposedly broken down, simply gone, as though she had never been there at all, save for the warmth still lingering against his palm. Marcus stood alone on that empty road for a long time, rain soaking through his jacket, waiting for an explanation that never came. He drove home that night in silence, but it was a different silence than before, lighter somehow, like a burden had quietly been lifted the moment he finally chose to stop. In the months that followed, people in Marcus's life began to notice the change before he ever tried to explain it. He reconciled with the nephew he'd stopped speaking to, forgiving a debt that had never really been about money. He returned to volunteering at his church, the same walls he'd quietly distanced himself from for years. Denise later said it felt like watching a man return from somewhere far away, somewhere she hadn't been sure he'd ever come back from. Marcus never told most people the full story of what happened on that road, but those closest to him noticed that somewhere along the way, he had become, once again, the kind of man who stopped. To this day, no one can say with certainty who, or what, the woman on that road truly was. Some who've heard Marcus's story believe she was nothing more than an elaborate coincidence, given meaning by a man ready to change. Others believe, as Elder Greaves did, that she was something far older than explanation, sent to stand at the exact place where a man's choices reveal who he really is. What remains certain is this: Marcus Whitfield was given a second chance that most people never receive. A chance to see clearly what his hardened heart had cost him, and the rare opportunity to choose differently the second time around. So we leave you with the same question Marcus was forced to answer that night, on a rain-soaked road outside a quiet Georgia town. If a stranger stood before you tonight, crying, asking for nothing but a moment of your time, would you stop? Would you recognize the test before it was too late? Or would you drive past, certain you had good reason, the way so many of us do every single day, without ever realizing what we're truly walking away from? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Marcus's place. And if this story moved you, stay close, because the next one might just change the way you see every stranger you pass tomorrow.